Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the third session for our Neurodiversity Global Seminar Series 2025. This is co-hosted by the Center for Neurodiversity and Development from Durham University and the Center for Neurodiversity Studies at OP Jindal Global University, India. And this monthly seminar series brings together researchers. We also have practitioners and advocates from around the world to explore neurodiversity. Our aim has been to create a platform where there can also be cross-cultural conversations, where we can amplify voices of neurodivergent individuals and promote inclusive practices globally. In January, we began our journey with Dr. Mary Hanley. She's here with us. She shared her valuable research on supporting autistic and neurodivergent learners in school environments. Her presentation on the AAA framework highlighted the importance of addressing attention, sensory arousal, and anxiety as interconnected elements. Her work also emphasized the need to consider these issues more holistically while acknowledging how the school environment itself impacts neurodiverse students' experiences. Last month, we had the privilege of learning from Dr. Amy Pearson from Durham University as an autism researcher. Dr. Pearson brought both professional expertise and lived experience to her presentation on the disproportionate rates of violence and abuse that's experienced by autistic individuals. Her research with autistic academics and community partners really reframed the risk factors within an ecological perspective that acknowledges the impact of societal stigma and ableism. Today, we are honored to welcome Professor Dawn Adams from Griffith University. And she's an internationally acclaimed academic with expertise in autism and disability. Professor Adams brings extensive experience with her work focusing on understanding and improving well-being and mental health outcomes for autistic individuals and those with developmental disabilities. And she collaborates closely with autistic and autism communities to ensure that her research is meaningful and relevant. Professor Adams will be speaking to us today about mental health in the context of autism and neurodiversity, exploring the elevated rates of mental health challenges which are faced by autistic and neurodivergent individuals, and the current gaps in tailored effective support. Her presentation will also examine research on identifying and understanding mental health in neurodivergent context, while also considering well-being and quality of life more broadly. We look forward to learning about the potential research and clinical pathways which could lead to improved mental health outcomes for neurodivergent individuals. So without further delay, I would like to welcome Professor Dawn Adams. Professor Adams, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the whole organising committee for inviting me here. It is 11 o'clock at night here, and any of you that have met me will know I'm not a night person. So I've actually been to bed and had a little sleep and got up. So apologies if it takes me a minute to get into giving a talk, but I couldn't miss this opportunity to connect with you all. I have got a copy of the slides I can send to anyone who can send around if that's helpful, so you're not scribbling down references as we go, so I can get those to the organisers afterwards. So I'll just share. Okay, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see that?
We can see
lovely. Okay. So good job I read the talk brief again when I was preparing this talk, because I started with this idea when I was writing the abstract that I would really think about the research in terms of understanding mental health and well-being in the context of both autism and neurodiversity. And as I was writing the talk, somewhere along the way, I have actually changed this to really be thinking about misunderstandings of mental health and well-being in the context of autism and neurodiversity. And the path I've really ended up taking this presentation down, and I hope you stay with me and you enjoy it, because it's really thinking about, we have all this research going on around mental health, particularly in autistic people, but in neurodivergent people more broadly, and why, despite that, there's still so many misunderstandings around mental health in neurodiversity. And I'm hoping that there's two big concepts I'm going to reflect on for this area, that anyone with any research area will be able to take those and really reflect on how they apply to their own research area. And in doing that, make improvements to your processes and to the evaluating the research that you build upon, so that we can do what we've actually all do research to do, which is to actually deliver better outcomes for neurodivergent people and those that love or support them. So I just want to place this talk in the context of myself, and then I'll explain the context where I come from in terms of a work setting. Thank you everyone for being here. It is always so lovely to see how the interest and passion towards neurodiversity research and autism research has increased over the years, and how actually we're realizing that by coming together and learning from each other, we can build in each other. This is not a competition. The competition is, if with anything, it's with changing the outcome data. The actual process of learning from each other and sharing is just incredible, and I encourage all of you to find as many areas to do that from research and clinical partners as possible. I can't see what you're doing, obviously, so if you need to do anything to make this more comfortable for you, then please do so. You don't have to sit still, you don't have to take notes. If you just want to listen, there's a recording, you can really take detailed notes afterwards. And I say that from being neurodivergent myself, and whilst I am neurodivergent, I'm not autistic, so I recognise the value that autistic people and their family members have added to my work, and I recognise the lens that I come out from my work is both an academic and clinical psychologist. I really value and I strive to conduct the highest level of participatory research for all of every single project. And so I make sure that I have community partners on every grant from the beginning, shaping the grant and with us along the way. In terms of funding, I receive funding from research councils and organisations like Departments of Education. I don't receive any funding from pharmaceuticals or genomics. And just for content warning, this talk will mention anxiety, mental health and suicide. So for those of you who don't know where Brisbane is and broader context around Australia, we are just there, so sort of 3 o'clock on the clock, and the ironic element of having a circle there after last week's events where we had a cyclone coming straight towards a city that is not cyclone ready, is when I saw it on the map I'd give, I was like, oh, there you go. If that was last week's event. We have power, we have internet, and we have water again now. So very, very grateful for that. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging that European settlement has a very short history in Australia, and that we have traditional owners and custodians of Australia. And for me, that's in Meanjin in Brisbane. That's the Turrbal and Yagara people. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I recognise their connection to country and their role in caring and maintaining for Australia for many thousands of years, and their role in learning and supporting diversity. And I think if we look to the values that underpin all Aboriginal cultures, we can see that actually inclusion and diversity and respecting people for their strengths and their differences we've seen across Australia. Okay, so I want to just take a minute, and I'm sure as you're here for a neurodiversity series, you're very aware of the definition of neurodiversity, but I think it's really important for us to take a moment to think about it when we're thinking about a topic within neurodiversity. So Helen McLennan, who is a PhD candidate at, she did a master's with us and then she's gone on to do a PhD at a different university. She's done a really nice review that was published in January this year, looking at all the definitions of neurodiversity and the conceptualizations of neurodiversity in empirical research since Sinclair's original definition. And in this, Helen concludes that actually every single definition, even though there's lots and lots out there, they come back to three critical elements. And it's about natural human variation. So this is an expected phenomenon. It's about how the brains process information and respond to information. So if we think about, there's the diagram from Embrace Autism on the side there, that neurodiversity is actually the variation in how every single brain processes and responds to information. Within that, we have neurotypes, so ways we can identify that people might think and process information in a same or similar way. So we have holistic people, so that's the majority of neurotypical, and then neurodivergent, and within that you would have your neurotypes such as autistic, ADHD, etc. And so if we look at that definition of neurodiversity, and we think about it, that means that every neurodivergent condition is characterized by the way a person thinks, communicates, and interacts with the world. It really sort of brings me very obviously to a question of why have we assumed for so many years that the mental health and well-being of people that think, communicate, and interact with the world in a different way is the same as people, as neurotypical people. It seems quite obvious within the definition that mental health, which is a result of how you think and interact with the world, would be different in neurotypical people. So if you take nothing else away from today, I'd really like to take you to take away this thought that to assume that mental health and therefore mental health problems are the same in neurodivergent people as neurotypical people means that we've been ignoring and belittling the unique cognitive, social, and physical experiences of being neurodivergent and saying they're irrelevant to mental health. And I think if you are neurodivergent yourself, or you spend time listening to neurodivergent people, it doesn't take long for you to realize that that simply isn't true. So therefore we need to change that assumption, and therefore if we do that, we need to be thinking about how that implies, or the implications of that for our research. So we have a lot of data to really indicate to us for many years that mental health is different for neurodivergent people. And one of them is if you look at prevalence rates. So I appreciate you probably won't be able to see the numbers on there, but the aim is not to think about the exact number, but you can see that this is a meta-analysis comparing people with intellectual disability, and they're looking at their rates of psychiatric disorders, so any psychiatric disorder. The prevalence there was 33.6%, which is much higher than in people without intellectual disability. There's another meta-analysis by Buckley where they looked at the pooled prevalence just in autistic people and compared to the pooled prevalence of neurotypical people. And we can see anxiety in all age groups is 3 times higher, depression at least twice as high, schizophrenia 10 times as high, etc. If you look at specific syndromes, and this is Georgie Edwards from when she was at Birmingham with Chris, looking at the pooled prevalence of anxiety in different syndromes, you can see that there's many syndromes where we've got this elevated rate. So that first one on the left there is Fragile X. We're looking, the pooled prevalence around 50%, Rett syndrome really high, and some of the duplication syndromes really high. So we've got this data and prevalence saying something different is going on if you're neurodivergent. And this has been collected for many, many years, and we really should have been listening to what that means rather than just reporting it as a fact. Sort of what does that mean and what's leading to that? If you look at multiple neurodivergent conditions, and I think we're now recognizing co-occurrence is the norm rather than not likely to happen. This graph shows you the anxiety. This is the depression prevalence rates in people with, on the left, they had all adolescents. The second group of columns along is no autism diagnosis, no ADHD diagnosis. And then we've got ADHD, no autism, autism, no ADHD, and then co-occurrence of autism with ADHD. And you can see as you have, if you're in the far right-hand column and you have two diagnoses. The prevalence rate of your mental health, of having a mental health condition, is much, much higher than having ADHD alone, for example, in the middle column, or neither ADHD and autism. So this really, again, provides evidence towards that statement at the beginning, which is like, actually, if you think and process and respond to the world in different ways, this will be impacting on your mental health outcomes and experiences. And we've got data to say that this is happening in a way that is actually leading to more negative mental health outcomes. So it won't be surprising then that multiple neurodivergent groups have identified mental health as a top priority research area. And when you look at the rather than just the prevalence rates, when you look at the outcome statistics, so suicide is an outcome statistic that is one of our biggest indicators of mental health within a population. We can see that autistic people without an intellectual disability are at increased risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviours, and non-autistic people, and Sarah Cassidy and Darren Headley's been doing brilliant work in that area. And we also see very high rates of suicidal behaviours in individuals with an intellectual disability. All of this really says to me that we need to get better at accurately identifying and diagnosing mental health and having effective supports and programs for mental health. But are we doing this effectively if we aren't taking neurotype and neurodiversity into account across all our work in mental health, not just in the supports and programs? So at the beginning, I said to you there'll be two questions which I'll pose, which will really, you could think about for any topic area, but really want you to think about in terms of mental health in the context of neurodiversity. And the first reflection question for the research is, are we acknowledging the complexity of mental health, of identifying and measuring mental health when we conduct research in the context of neurodiversity? I will unapologetically focus on the research around autism here. This is the area I'm most familiar, but it's also the research we have the most evidence for. But the concepts aren't unique to autism. If we go back to that definition for neurodiversity, the concepts are the same for many neurodivergent conditions. We just have a lot more research to draw upon in the context of autism for us to really reflect on. So when we think about answering this question, identifying, measuring mental health in the context of neurodiversity, the primary thing that always I encourage people to think about is diagnostic overshadowing. Now, what's really interesting is when I was doing my PhD with Chris Oliver at Birmingham, I did my PhD in identifying dementia in individuals with Down syndrome. So actually, we were talking about diagnostic overshadowing then. So, and we talk about it now in identifying mental health in neurodiversity. It's a concept that when you work in the area of neurodiversity, I think we need to be aware of in many areas. So it's where the characteristics of one condition can overshadow the identification of another condition. So when it comes to autism and anxiety, for example, someone might have repetitive behaviours because of their autism, but they may also have repetitive behaviours that are indicative that we'd see in anxiety, and they might go up and down because of their anxiety, but someone's only seeing them and attributing them to the characteristics of autism. Another one might be, repeated questions or needing to know. We see that in a lot of kids who have anxiety, but if an autistic young person does it, it might be attributed to their autism rather than their anxiety, or vice versa. Something else we need to be very aware of is who we ask for information. So we can recently, this study was out, I think maybe a week ago, one of our PhD candidates asked autistic adults and parents of autistic children about how state and trait anxiety presents in autistic children. Now, this gives us a really good list of things that might have come under the diagnostic overshadowing, but actually it also shows us that there's the signs of anxiety, state anxiety at the top, trait anxiety at the bottom, And the signs in the overlapping part are the only signs that they both groups told us. So we asked them to give us qualitative answers here. They described what it looks like or what it feels like, rather than us using a checklist and assuming we know. We went to them and asked. And you can see that actually, when you ask different groups, there's a large number of informant-specific signs that a person will prioritize telling you, or or be more likely to report. And actually, there was very few that overlapped. Now, inter-informant differences I see as a valuable source of information, because obviously, parents are more likely to describe behavioral things than the autistic person themselves. But when we're just thinking about how we measure, and when we're thinking about how we identify, we need to make sure we've got this inter-informant difference, and difference in perspective, and difference in kind of what they prioritize as reflective of anxiety or a mental health condition. We need to make sure we understand that, and we need to make sure we're considering that in our measurements. Because if we actually get the diagnosis wrong, or we don't give someone a diagnosis, there's a lot of research actually to say that this could have a really negative impact. And actually, people also, when you read the lived experience of having a diagnosis changed or diagnostic error, sometimes getting a right diagnosis can be a relief, and it can be a positive place to be. But it can be, doesn't, even if it is a positive outcome there, it doesn't negate the experience of having it all questioned, and the challenge of going through all that diagnostic process again and having to develop a new identity, etc. So diagnosing accurately and doing a good job is really, it's not just a nice to have, it's a really important thing to have if we're going to avoid those negative consequences of changing or diagnostic error or changing diagnoses. So we need to be aware that we need to be looking for multiple elements and identifying those that might be diagnostically overshadowed. It gets a little bit more complicated because we need to be aware that also mental health can present differently in autistic people and neurodivergent people. So Connor Kearns, who does really, really good work, back in 2014 did a sort of seminal paper where she highlighted that was a lot of anxiety symptoms in autistic people align with that are described in the DSM-5, but there are also autism distinct signs. And in fact, a third of people, 15% of people only showed autism distinct signs of anxiety, and a third of people showed a combination of DSM-5 consistent and autism distinct signs. And the autism distinct signs are almost like that interaction between anxiety and autism characteristics. So someone might feel anxiety around a change to routine, an anxiety around a new experience, or an anxiety around their deep or focused interest. You can see how they link to the autism characteristics, and almost those sort of experiences interact to create a very, we used to call it autism specific, but now it's autism distinct experience of anxiety. And in fact, a recent systematic review that another PhD student, Emma Hines, did, where she went through every single paper that reported on the signs of depression in autistic people, coded to whether they, the signs reported aligned to DSM-5 criteria or were additional signs. And she noted that almost 92% of articles that were reporting on signs of depression in autistic people reported signs that don't align with the DSM-5. And the most common of these was actually a change in autism characteristics. So increased stimming, increased repetitive behaviours, increased sensory challenges. But also something that we've then got quite interested in, which is almost like an autistic anhedonia. So not getting joy from a deep or focused interest that you would normally do. So some people engage in them less, or some people keep doing them but just not get it for the routine and predictability, but actually don't get that joy from the deep or focused interest that they usually get. And Emma's been interviewing autistic adults about non-DSM-5 signs of depression, and we're seeing very similar, a lot of people talking about this autistic anhedonia. and also depression attacks, which is quite interesting, where it's almost like a panic attack, but the depression comes on really, really intensely for a short period. So that's currently being submitted, and hopefully we'll have a preprint up before we submit that. So we might have we need to sort of be looking with a different lens and being more careful. We might have a different presentation. We also might have a different process. So Alex Wilson's undertaken, from Newcastle, has undertaken a series of studies around social anxiety in autistic people. And if this interests you, I'd recommend reading their work. And this paper concludes that actually social anxiety for autistic people might be coming from a different place, and from a clash between the self and the social world. And actually it might be a result of sort of social trauma and actual real genuinely receiving negative feedback on social experiences, or instead of them being anxiety driven, actually this social anxiety we might see in autistic people might actually be based on traumatic previous events or previous feedback that they received from people, rather than the kind of hypothesized future social challenges that social anxiety might typically be characterized by. And actually, Alex goes so far to say that social anxiety needs to be understood specifically in the context of autism, and this is neglected, therapy is unlikely to be helpful. And that was based on the data in that table on the bottom right there, where autistic people said what therapy type they had received for social anxiety and whether they found it helpful or not. And a very depressing statistic that only 8% of autistic people who received CBT for social anxiety actually found it helpful. So we can see how these multiple layers we're layering on differences for autistic people mean that actually it's much more complex than just applying models from neurotypical people and assuming they work. Because as we go further, and we don't just think about different presentations and processes, we actually have different cognitions perhaps driving some of the mental health challenges we see in autistic people. So a systematic review of autistic young people's experience of anxiety by Nielsen suggests that there's actually a different role of time. So anxiety is usually worrying about future events, but for autistic young people, most of them talk about worrying or spending a lot of time being anxious about things that have already happened, and have they made mistakes, and sort of deconstructing what's happened and getting anxious about that, rather than worrying about the future. And some of our work has showed that actually anxiety is much more typically presented behaviorally than physiologically, and a lot of it is driven by the intolerance of uncertainty model, or challenges of uncertainty, which is a feeling that we have less knowledge than we would like, and assuming the situation is therefore going to be bad or negative. And when you have an intolerance of uncertainty, you either seek reassurance or you avoid the situation. And when we distributed autism-specific measures of anxiety developed by Jackie Rogers at Newcastle, UK, to autistic people, young people, so there's 4 to 5-year-olds on the left and 10 to 11-year-olds, sorry, 5 to 6 on the left, 10 to 11 on the right. And the wider bars is that more signs of this element of anxiety was reported. So in both groups, challenges of uncertainty was the most commonly reported. The most symptoms of anxiety related to challenges of uncertainty. For both groups, anxious arousal, so physiological signs of anxiety, were least commonly reported. So this has actually led then to people thinking we actually need autism-specific models of mental health, and we have multiple models being proposed for anxiety in autistic people. And I tend to use the Self and Rogers one at the top, and which actually really highlights the drivers on the left, which go all the way to anxiety symptoms on the right. So if you just try and think about the anxiety symptoms on the bottom right, you're missing all the autism elements that lead into the anxiety. But there's also, and hold on to your hats for this next slide, actually even more complicated models. Now, I don't think anyone thinks this is going to inform a program or intervention, but it's a really nice review by Lai, who looks at the research about all the elements, the genetic elements, the social cultural elements, cognitive features, and adverse life experiences, which and their evidence towards leading for different mental health conditions in autistic people. And it's a really interesting read in terms of thinking about not just the person's factors that we often think about in when delivering psychological therapy, so the cognitive factors, but the social contextual determinants like the environment, stigmatization, being misunderstood, and the evidence that that has for leading to mental health problems in autistic people. So you can see, then you might not be surprised that if we have different processes, different presentations, different processes and different models, people are now beginning to develop different measures. Or maybe not, we're not necessarily very far at developing different measures. We've got a good anxiety, autism-specific anxiety measure, but actually we now got to a point where people are saying, okay, maybe how we're measuring it isn't right. And the JCPP review on the right there, that was 2017, but actually their conclusion still stands. That they were very bold in saying the practical usefulness of accumulated quality of life evidence to date is limited due to gaps in non- and under-investigated groups, a non-trivial risk of bias, generalizability of the results in too many homogeneous groups, and threats to validity in measuring quality of life. I really hope that we don't have a review in 10 years' time that also says the practical usefulness of our more recent research is limited. But we have to do something different if we want that statement to be different. And we are beginning to see a small change in autism-specific programs or supports based on those autism-specific models. And I know there's more in the pipeline with more research around cues, for example, in young autistic people. If you are interested in reading a really interesting design of delivering psychological therapy to autistic people, the paper in the top right from Jackie Rogers' team, a pilot randomized controlled trial exploring a personalized modular psychological intervention, is really interesting. So it's a randomized controlled trial, pilot randomized controlled trial, and they personalize everybody's therapy depending on their profile and their priorities coming in. So they were really addressing the elements of mental health that were important to the autistic person, but still managed to do it within a randomized controlled trial, which was very clever. So that's a lot of information, and I just wanted to take a moment to encourage you to think about that and reflect. So I've questioned how well we're doing at considering the complexity of neurodiversity when we identify and measure mental health. And I've stepped you through all the differences we now know about in mental health. So when you read papers on mental health or quality of life, or if you yourself include a measure of mental health or quality of life, I want you to think about whether you've considered all of these issues and therefore the impact on what you can say. If so, how and when? And if not, what impact might this have on what we're interpreting from maybe a single score on a measure not designed to take into account all those elements of mental health? And I encourage people to reflect, not to feel bad, but actually to make a change into the future. Because the first step of improving is recognizing where we can improve. Okay. So the second half of this talk, I wanted to address the kind of second big question that I had, where I think is the area that I think is contributing to misunderstanding of mental health in the context of neurodiversity. And that's really, are we just considering neurodivergent people's mental health, the whole mental health, or are we just considering their mental health disorders? So There's multiple models of full of total mental health, complete mental health that are available. But I'll introduce the KEYS model because it's an easy one to kind of get your understand the concept. So KEYS has a dual continuum model of mental health, and this suggests that mental health well-being, which is represented on the vertical axis, and a mental illness or mental health challenges, which is represented on the vertical axis. They're two continua and they're interrelated, but they both combine to contribute to your overall experience of mental health. KEYS claims this is a transdiagnostic model, and it's a way to conceptualize mental health, not diagnose mental health. It's not yet been fully explored in autism or neurodiversity that I have seen, but I think Jonathan Weiss's team is doing some work on this. And I'm not suggesting it's perfect, but I just think it's a useful framework for us to reflect on in terms of where we go to supporting autistic people to experiencing, or neurodivergent people to experiencing better mental health. So just sort of put up the definitions for each of the areas. So let's think about if you have high subjective well-being. So that's 2 boxes at the top. If you are in the box on the top left, that means you have high mental health challenges, but high subjective well-being. And this is what they call struggling. So you experience high well-being despite mental health challenges. This is a small proportion of people, but if you have a mental health condition that is more that has comes in sort of comes on, it has a cyclical nature. Sometimes you can experience well-being despite experiencing mental health conditions. If you go on the top right, flourishing and thriving, this is where we would all be aiming for everybody to reach. So it's the ideal state where you experience happiness, high subjective well-being, and no mental health. If you go to the bottom, we have low well-being. So the bottom left is floundering, and that's where you have poor mental health and poor well-being. And languishing, the bottom right, which is actually a subjective state of unhappiness, but no mental health disorder. And I think it's this bottom right category that actually we've not been really paying enough attention to. And I think a lot of neurodivergent people will have spent times of their life in this languishing. So no mental health disorder, but not experiencing subjective well-being. And actually the research around in neurotypical people is that if you spend long enough in languishing, you're at an increased risk of moving over to floundering because you'll develop a mental health condition. But actually, if we're just focusing on reducing mental health and not improving well-being, we're actually saying it's okay to stay in that bottom right box, right of languishing, and that's all we're going to aim our research to do, rather than doing what actually I think what we all want to do is to support people to flourish and thrive and experience the ideal state of functioning of well-being with positive with no mental health conditions. And so when I was looking at the sort of application of this model to neurodivergent conditions, as I said, I didn't see a lot of research on it, but actually I did see there was a population-based study of mental well-being, and in there they did report on people who disclosed a diagnosis of ADHD compared to neurotypical people. And they saw that we're looking at roughly half the number of people with ADHD in that flourishing and thriving box for neurotypical people. I don't think that's acceptable. I don't think we should be saying that's fine. If we are in an equitable society and if we are doing a great job at delivering research which aims to improve the mental health or complete mental health of neurodivergent people, we need to see that statistic rise. So but to do that, to change that statistic, we need to think about how we construct well-being and how we understand well-being and what we can use to improve well-being. And Gary Lamb wrote this critical review of all the academic literature constructing well-being on autistic adults, and I really enjoyed reading it. It's challenging to think I've fallen into some of these non-ideal categories before, but they looked at all the research reporting on well-being and then said, okay, how is well-being constructed in this paper? And they kind of split it into two ways that the academics thought about well-being. One of them was the first one, and then they had two like subgroups within each. So the first one is that they sort of took well-being to be a measurable thing at the current way. So the first group of papers, which was predominant, was where autistic well-being was an objective, uncontested variable, but it's the same cross-culturally with the same definition. And that you could use a single measure for it, and that single measure or the definition wasn't questioned in the paper. So it's, here's a measure of quality of life. We delivered it. Here's the findings. 1B group used the same kind of approach that we can measure well-being with a questionnaire, but they did question the measure, whether it was valid for autistic people, but they tended to do this in the discussion rather than setting a study up with that concept up front. The second sort of category of studies questioned the ability to measure well-being and sort of in autism as the same construct as non-autistic people. So 2A said that well-being requires a specific measure for autistic people, but the values were still placed on scores rather than experience. And they kind of introduced the importance of understanding well-being specifically within a neurotype in the introduction, so kind of situated their study in that. And then 2B were the few studies that situated well-being within the accounts of people that have experienced it, autistic well-being, so that privileges and centres autistic people's perspectives above having a single defined way to measure outcome. And Gary and the team kind of set this challenge at the end. So we recommend that researchers and practitioners critically reflect on how they engage autistic adults and use their input to create works that support well-being in ways that are meaningful and ethical and do justice to changing the broader narratives of autism in research and society. So if we try and see what we've learned from studies that are in category 2, what do we know about autistic young people's well-being? So there's a systematic review by Kate Cooper's group from Bath, where they found 37 papers, predominantly for sort of 10 to 23-year-olds, but there was 23% reported on under 10-year-olds and 23% on over 24-year-olds. And this is where they asked autistic young people, this is a meta-synthesis of studies that asked autistic young people or parents of autistic young people about what well-being is for autistic young people. And they found 3 key areas that came up across the studies, which was the well-being is based on a balance of growth versus recuperation, a need for social connection to make sense of being autistic, and an entirely derived source of pleasure with intense interest bringing positive feelings. But they actually conclude that these themes might be apparent in a similar study with non-autistic people, which really kind of made me feel not particularly aligning necessarily with that second group. And actually we need more work which tells us what is specific to well-being in a neurotype that we want to work with. In contrast, the research in the adult population is flourishing. It's really like you can see these papers, top left 2025, bottom left 2025, that was out 2 days ago, and 2024 papers on the right. We really are hearing much more from autistic adults about what well-being and quality of life means to them and what leads to it. But actually, there's no point thinking about groups differently. It would be really good if we can think about combining groups and learning from multiple informants, going back to that point at the beginning, learning from multiple informants to see if we can get multi-informant things that everybody sort of identifies as important so that we can prioritize these when we go forward. So I just want to finish by talking through some work we've tried to do in that area. This is a preprint available on OSF, led by Kate Simpson and our team. And we asked autistic adults and parents of autistic children what leads to autistic children being able to live their best life, so well-being kind of later. We had autistic and non-autistic interviewers. The data was analysed by autistic and neurodivergent researchers, as well as 4 community partners, which include 1 autistic-led organisation. And the paper goes into a lot more depth than I could go to in this talk. He'll do a whole talk on it. But actually, the two groups, the close agreed on these areas is important. Being accepted by others, that was foundational. And once you're accepted, you can make positive connections and you feel you can have a sense of control. Only autistic adults spoke about the detrimental impact of not being accepted. Theme 2, both the informant groups identified finding things that light the child up. So having allowing people to engage in the interests that bring them passion, not the interests or activities that a neurotypical person thinks a child should do. Having a sense of control, and the physical and sensory environments, and being in environments that support your sensory profile rather than bring challenges. So we've analysed that data, and now we've actually used it plus a child self-report study to develop the first that we know of co-produced parent group, which focuses on enhancing wellbeing and quality of life. So bringing up that vertical arrow of the model. So it doesn't focus on reducing mental health difficulties. It really focuses on bringing people up from on the wellbeing. We've just finished the feasibility and acceptability trial, and in fact, Catherine, the postdoc on the project, is here and has been putting the data sets together. So we'll be looking at that over the next week. And when we go back to Gary Lamb's critiques, we really thought about making sure this research had measures with meaning. So we allowed parents to develop their own measure with their own indicators of wellbeing for their child, and then they rated those pre and post, as well as standardized measures. We had interviews, autism-specific quality of life outcomes, and also the general quality of life outcomes that we included, so we can look into them in more detail. So that is a lot of information. And if you're going to Autism Europe, we'll be presenting the outcomes from the Bloom Parent Programme trial at Autism Europe. We just had our abstract accepted, so we're all excited to be coming to Dublin. So I'll just spend a minute just wrapping up, because that is a lot of information. And like I said, very happy to send you the slides. Let's take us back to the beginning and think about this. Neurodivergent people experience some of the highest rates of mental health problems and experience lower well-being than neurotypical people. We have this mountain of evidence now to show us that mental health, so both mental health challenges and well-being, is different in neurotypical people, different presentations, different processes, different cognitions. All of those impact on how we measure mental health and then how we the supports. And of course, if we're thinking about evaluation of those supports, obviously measurement falls into that too. Every year, there are hundreds of articles on mental health and wellbeing in neurodivergent people. And every time you see an article come through, that means that neurodivergent people or their supporters, usually, unless it's a review, they've given time to making that article happen. They've given time to giving data. So how are we actually doing the best job and making sure that people are giving their time to studies that are going to make the biggest difference? Are we truly considering neurotype in every stage of our work? How do we work towards flourishing rather than accepting a path towards languishing? And finally, how do we all work together to ensure we build on knowledge and create the biggest change? And a seminar series such as this is a brilliant example of where we can do that and where we can really come together without the barriers of travel, without the costs, etc. So Debbie and team, thank you and congratulations on setting the series up, because I think it really will advance the field. So I'm a big, when I hear quotes that I like, I always try and incorporate them into talks. So to move a mountain, you begin by carrying small stones. So have a think about all the information I presented and really make it an intention of what the stone will be that you will move in your research or in your practice to create a positive change for better mental health outcomes for neurodivergent people. I'll just finish the slide there. That's my email if you want to get in touch. If I've set up something called Neuronews, where we're going to send out all preprints and published copyright-free versions of the published articles to people's inboxes. If you don't want to spend time researching for research, that's something new we have set up there. So the link is there if people want to register. But other than that, I shall stop sharing and see if everyone's still there.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Dawn. That was absolutely brilliant and such an important overview and critical issues in how we think about doing research in this area of mental health and neurodiversity, and some of the challenges as well as some of the opportunities to really make it right going forward as well, and really capture the needs of a neurodiverse society and neurodivergent individuals.